As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off. The UK Tory government is taking the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to court, questioning the legality of the act that has been passed by a cross-party majority in the Scottish Parliament to try and protect devolved law from the consequences of Brexit.
What's your thoughts on Brexit?
I think it's an absolute burdock.
I think the Brexit debate really, and the mess that's been
It's my understanding that neither the Cabinet Secretary nor the First Minister has met with any of the Scottish mesh survivors. Given this is the biggest healthcare scandal since thalidomide, and it's now affecting thousands of women, and now men too, will the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister agree to meet with me and a delegation of Scottish mesh survivors? And given the start findings of Professor Britton's report, will the Cabinet Secretary now instruct a new and truly independent report into the use of mesh in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Findlay for that question. I am very content to accept his invitation to meet with Scottish mesh survivors. I cannot, of course, speak for the First Minister's diary. In terms of the request for a new inquiry, I should make the point in passing that Professor Britton's report is primarily around how the government organises, sets up and oversees independent inquiries, and therefore is not exclusively for me. However, I have written to John Wilkinson, who's Director of Devices at the MHRA, asking him to provide me with his evidence on which that body has judged that mesh products are safe for use in clinical practice, and the CMO has written in similar terms to the Chief Executive of the MHRA. When we receive that response, then we will be able to take a decision on other matters concerning the use of mesh in clinical practice across Scotland.
Thank you. Question number 2, John Finnie.
Thank you, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how many vessels are in its marine and fisheries protection fleet.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
Marine Scotland into Compliance owns and operates 3 ships which provide a dedicated enforcement capacity. These are Jura, Herta and Minna, the last of which I visited in June this year in Oban. We've also got access to 5 rigid-hulled inflatable boats on a daily basis to enhance the enforcement activity.
John Finnie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. I wonder will the Cabinet Secretary provide an update to Parliament on the findings of the review which the Cabinet Secretary told me was ongoing in a letter dated April 16, 2018, and to which the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy alluded to at the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee on the 6th of June 2018. With a challenge with the growing number of MPAs, Brexit, and I think there is a comparator when it's the case that the Welsh Government, who are responsible for a considerably smaller marine area, have recently commissioned and are building 5 marine compliance vessels in Wales. Does the Cabinet Secretary really believe it's right that Wales has a bigger fleet than Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there are a number of things I could take up there. First of all is that the review that both my colleague Fergus Ewing and myself refer to is the constant review under which we keep issues such as this. I think the member will also recall in my reply that we have 2 surveillance aircraft and also make regular use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, which adds considerably to our surveillance capacity. With respect to the Welsh Government position, as I understand it, yes, indeed, the Welsh are in the process of buying new boats, but they are considerably smaller than the boats which are in the Marine Scotland fleet and are of a very different order of technology. So I don't think you can really compare like to like.
Question number 3, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to encourage local sourcing across public sector catering.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is committed to encouraging and increasing local sourcing of food and drink across the public sector. Good progress has been made, and we know that around 48% of food and drink sourced in the public sector is Scottish, a 41% increase since 2007. We believe that we can do more, and we have put in place a range of measures and support to try and increase levels further.
Bill Kidd.
I thank the Minister for that response, and I welcome all movement towards local sourcing. Does the Minister agree that consumption shifts, such as buying locally and seasonally, are important in moving Scotland along a sustainable path?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, yes, I do, and I would welcome the progress made by 11 local authorities in the Food for Life programme. And I very much believe that local procurement is something that's desirable both for our schools, our hospitals, our prisons and our whole public sector, but also for our food producers, our farmers and suppliers. And we're doing very many things in order to increase this yet further.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. East Ayrshire Council have a great reputation for sourcing food for schools local. I think somewhere in the region of over 75% of their food is sourced locally. Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise that the Scottish Government could use the Central Excel contract to ensure all of Scotland's school children get this very same opportunity to access quality, locally produced food?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, yes, I'm very much aware of the good work that the Council does, and I know that, for example, Corrie Mains Farm in East Ayrshire supplies all the eggs to primary schools. We are actually a wee bit ahead of the member, I'm very pleased to say, because we're already doing what he's urged me to do today. We have been for some time, and I'm very pleased to say that following the good work in 11 local authorities in Scotland, we are now expanding the programme to reach more schools by investing £400,000 for the next 3 years to target all 32 local authorities. So I'm sure the member will be delighted to hear that positive news.
Question 4, Stewart Stevenson.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the Scottish Health Technologies Group's advice statement regarding the use of Freestyle Libre flash glucose monitoring system.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
We welcome the advice statement from the Scottish Health Technologies Group with regard to the flash glucose monitoring system. The advice statement has provided information on the clinical and cost effectiveness of this technology and supported NHS boards in determining the place of this technology for local use.
Stewart Stevenson.
I welcome the decision of NHS Grampian in particular to act on this advice and wonder whether this statement has had any further impact on the uptake of this life-transforming technology by other health boards across Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Stevenson for that supplementary question. It is important to note that the device is used for self-monitoring of glucose levels via a sensor worn, but it is, as with many other drugs and devices, not suitable for all patients and requires to have that clinical judgment performed. Freestyle Libre sensor is now available for prescription in 13 out of the 14 NHS board areas, and NHS Highland is currently working with the local diabetes service to become the 14th board, and I'm delighted about that. Mr Stevenson's point on life-transforming technologies is well made, and as our leading clinicians and clinical researchers work with companies involved in terms of precision medicine and technologies, we are very mindful of the new demands that will come in terms of how we determine what is clinically suitable, either in drugs or in devices such as this in terms of technologies, and look to adapt our processes accordingly.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As co-chair of the cross-party group on diabetes, I've had very positive feedback about Freestyle Libre, particularly the benefit of reducing the need for frequent finger prick blood tests and well-maintained HbA1c levels, that's the blood glucose levels. Can the Cabinet Secretary please confirm that technology has been dispensed throughout Scotland according to the prescribed guidelines without caveats?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Stewart for that question and indeed for the work of the cross-party group as he chairs it. My expectation is that the device will be prescribed according to the guidance. That is my absolute expectation from all the health boards concerned, so that is all of our territorial boards, and I would certainly want to know if that was not the case so that I could take action accordingly.
Question number 5, Alasdair Allan.
To ask the Scottish Government what progress has been made in securing work for the Arnish fabrication yard on the Isle of Lewis.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
We continue to press developers to use Scottish contractors when building projects off our coastline, and we encourage our supply chain to be as competitive as possible when bidding for these contracts. We have confidence that the new owners of Bifab are doing everything possible to secure new contracts and restore employment to the yard at Arnish as well as Burn Island and Methil.
Alasdair Allan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his reply and welcome that progress. Given their obvious interest in the matter, will the Cabinet Secretary undertake to keep representatives of the former workforce at Arnish updated directly, particularly around any news around new contracts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I will commit to do that. I have engaged with the trade unions and there's good partnership working with the local authority as well, engaging with DF Barnes and Bifab. And I think it's really important that we have a united Team Scotland approach to try and secure work for these yards. In addition to that, I will arrange a briefing for elected members who will be interested as well, so that we can discuss further actions to secure work for the yards and ensure that people can return to that fruitful employment.
Rhoda Grant.
Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the equipment in the yard is being kept up to date and maintained, because it's owned by High, very expensive equipment and crucial to the yard's future?
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't have that detail to hand. I'm happy to supply further information to the member, but of course there has been substantial investment in terms of the technology. The important thing right now is to secure those contracts, that work, those benefits to the supply chain, and that's absolutely what I'm focused on in working with the new owners. Of course, there's a financial support package as well to try and preserve the ability there to secure work. We're working very hard to get those contracts, and therefore every element that ensures that the yards are attractive, including the infrastructure, is absolutely vital and important. But the key critical issue right now is the ability to win contracts, and on that I'm absolutely focused. Again, I'm happy to have a private briefing with interested elected members to see the efforts that we are undertaking to achieve that outcome.
Thank you. Question 6, Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support it is providing to help grow the life sciences sector.
Minister Ivan McKee.
Life science is a growth sector for the Scottish economy. We're increasing innovation in the sector through the procurement of public services, and the Chief Science Office is investing £3 million from 2018 to 19 to support collaborative working between the NHS, industry and academia. Another recent investment includes £15 million contribution to the New Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre, which will support the production of new medicines efficiently and safely. We're also working with Life Sciences Scotland, the industry leadership group, to ensure we have the right policy environment to support sectoral growth.
Miles Briggs.
Can the Minister confirm that the Scottish Government is not on course to meet its original target set in 2011 to double the turnover of the life science sector in Scotland to £6.2 billion by 2020, and that the Government has now extended that target to 2025? Does the Minister agree with me that Scotland's dynamic pharmaceutical sector, whose importance was demonstrated this week in the Fraser-Allan report, is key to meeting that future target? And what specific action will the Scottish Government take to improve data capturing capabilities and to link primary and secondary care data to allow more investment in clinical trials to actually realise the potential of Scotland's life sciences sector?
Minister.
The target for growth of the sector is to grow from 4 million turnover to 8 million turnover. And data will be coming out shortly that I will see, but I would believe would confirm that we're on target to meet that growth target. In terms of what we're doing, what the sector's doing, the member will be aware that the First Minister recently opened the 54 million GSK Pharmaceutical Production Centre in Montrose. And in terms of what's happening with increasing innovation within the sector, the Scottish Government continues to work with the Industry Leadership Group, with the SMS IC and with iBio IC to support innovation in the sector. In terms of what's happening specifically with the NHS, the Scottish Government continues to support the Health Innovation Partnerships and to work with the Scottish Health Innovations Limited and the Golden Jubilee to increase the cooperation between the NHS and life sciences sector to grow innovation within the sector, increase its turnover and its exports.
Question 7 has not been lodged. Question 8, Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank the presiding officer, and can I ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what action it is taking to encourage doctors to relocate to rural practices?
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Our strategy to recruit and retain GPs underpins our commitment to recruit 800 additional practising GPs by 2027, backed by £7.5 million investment in this financial year. The £2 million invested in a rural package includes the Scottish Rural Medicine Collaborative, Golden Hellos and a relocation package. And we've also committed an additional £30 million by 2021 to support all GPs with premises-related liabilities, reducing the risk to practices. And finally, I did launch our first graduate medicine programme, which will lead to an additional 330 medical graduates by 2028, primarily focused on remote and rural GP practices.
Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Now, I, as well as GPs in my constituency, are well aware of these programmes. However, they are simply not working for the rural community. So can I ask the Government to look to review them to ensure that they can effectively encourage GPs to relocate to rural practices?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Burnett for that additional question. I would be very interested to see on what evidence he bases such a widespread and wide-ranging assertion. That is certainly not the experience that I have, or indeed the evidence of our remote and rural working group or the Rural Collaborative organisation, which of course are made up of GPs with experience in remote and rural areas. None of us said that this would be easy, and none of us said that it was without challenge, but I have yet to hear of any additional constructive suggestions from the member or any of the other opposition groups as to what we might do more of to add to the successful work of the actions that I've outlined.
Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on what progress has been made by the Remote and Rural General Practice Working Group on how the new GP contract will work for rural areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Ross for that additional question. The Remote and Rural Working Group has commenced a programme of engagement with GPs, multidisciplinary clinicians and healthcare service providers to listen to their concerns, but also to hear from them what more they believe on the basis of their experience and their evidence we can do. One of the additional propositions that is going to come our way is to include a dispensing practice training proposal. And this morning I had a very productive discussion with one of our rural colleges looking at how we can add to the multidisciplinary teams, not only in our acute setting, but also in primary care and in particular in those practices.
Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Devon Medical Practice in Banff will close shortly as it has been impossible to recruit a new GP. This critical shortage of GPs is due to workforce planning mismanagement and an underfund of £658 million to the GP service over the last 4 years. This will be the 11th practice to close in the past 11 years in Grampian and will leave nearly 6,300 patients without a GP practice. When will this SNP government act to solve this desperate crisis in the NHS?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I have made consistently clear, I do not underestimate the challenges, and as an MSP from a rural constituency myself, I'm well aware of the challenges of GP numbers and GP practices in those rural constituencies. But I have to say, I find it beyond impertinence that the member from those benches should argue with us about underfunding when they are part of a UK government that has shortchanged this NHS by failing to meet their promises, the promises they made in June, and a few short months later they have undercut us yet again.
Question number 9, Tom Arthur.
To ask the Scottish Government how it supports culture and tourism in Renfrewshire and East Renfrewshire.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government continues to support cultural activities across Scotland with an increase of almost 10% culture funding this year, despite UK Government cuts. Creative Scotland is the lead public body supporting the arts and fund a range of cultural activity across Renfrewshire and East Renfrewshire. Through our funding of Visit Scotland, we continue to market the fantastic tourism assets there, and of course the Youth Music Initiative and the Cashback for Creativity also supports culture for young people in communities there.
Tom Arthur.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. My constituency of Renfrewshire South, of course, is home to Eldersley, the birthplace of Sir William Wallace. Two of my SNP local government colleagues, Councillor Andy Steele and Councillor Jacqueline Cameron, have recently secured support from the Council to explore ways in which Eldersley can capitalise upon this status. Would the Cabinet Secretary be willing to meet with myself, Councillor Steele and Councillor Cameron to discuss how the Scottish Government can support this project?
Cabinet Secretary.
I understand the Renfrewshire Visitor Plan 2018 to 2021 looks at marketing the region in lots of different ways, including promoting its rich historical past, not least the Wallace connections to Eldersley. I'm more than happy to find out more about what that tourism offer is and to meet with the member to discuss that further.
Thank you very much. That concludes general questions. We'll turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlow.
Thank you. Can I ask the First Minister, which plan delivers public spending in real terms over the coming years higher, the UK Government's budget plan or the SNP's Growth Commission?
First Minister.
Well, let me be very clear that as a result of the budget on Monday, the UK Government budget, the budget of the Scottish Government will be cut in real terms by almost £2 billion between the Tories coming to office in 2010 and the end of this decade, highlighting that austerity under the Tories is far from over. They continue to deliver tax cuts for the richest and just cuts for everybody else. By contrast, the Growth Commission recommends real terms increases in spending to protect our vital public services.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, if that's austerity, the First Minister's going to have to think of a new word to describe life under her miserable plans, because that's quite something. And whatever else that was, it wasn't an answer to the simple question I asked. On Sunday, Derek Mackay swaggered round the TV studio saying, "Show me the money." Well, on Monday, the Chancellor did. And what the First Minister won't admit, is that the UK budget has now set a course for public spending to increase within the UK at 1.4% a year in real terms up to 2023-24, whereas the SNP's Growth Commission, their evangelical Bible of economic misery, forecast public spending in an independent Scotland to increase by just 0.5%. First Minister, those are the facts. So I ask you again, which plan proposes to increase spending by more in Scotland? The UK Government's bold proposals or the SNP's miserable Growth Commission?
First Minister.
Independence and control of our own resources, we can ensure real terms increase in public spending. That is the prize of independence. But let's go back to the budget and the reality of the UK Government Tory budget announced on Monday. That will result in cuts to the Scottish Government budget of £2 billion over the decade that the Tories have been in power. Most of the consequentials in next year, of course, are earmarked for the National Health Service. When that is taken out, and we will pass them on to the National Health Service, I should say, as an aside, the Tories have even managed to short changes on that. We were meant to get £600 million in consequentials next year. We're only seeing £550 million of that delivered. And if that shortfall continues over the planning period, that will see the Tories shortchange the Scottish people to the tune of more than £250 million. That is absolutely shameful. But, you know, if Jackson Carlaw doesn't want to take my word for it, perhaps he can listen to the think tanks, and the experts have all had their say on the budget over the last few days. The Resolution Foundation is not the end of austerity. Existing promises of extra spending in some areas mean the Chancellor's numbers imply ongoing cuts in other day-to-day public services. So we know what the Tories stand for. The mask has well and truly slipped. It slipped before we even got to Halloween this year. Tax cuts for the wealthiest and cuts for everybody else. That's the reality of the Tories, and this government stands for something very different indeed.
Jackson Carlaw.
How miserably predictable. Here's the reality. The Scottish Government will receive an extra £500 million more in real terms next year. That's what the independent Scottish parliamentary researcher Spice have declared. And yet the SNP are so focused on finding the cloud in every silver lining, it can't even bring itself to welcome a single penny of that money, let alone £500 million of it. Worse still, the Finance Secretary has also indicated that he will refuse to pass on tax cuts which will benefit middle-income families elsewhere in the UK. Will the First Minister give any hope of tax relief to people like senior teachers, nurses and police officers who, without it, face paying a bill of £1,000 extra in income tax compared to those doing exactly the same job elsewhere in the UK? Will she?
First Minister.
However Jackson Carlaw tries to spin it, the reality is cuts to this government's budget as a result of decisions taken by the Tory Chancellor. I've got the figures here. £2 billion over the decade is the real terms cut in the budget of this government. That amounts to almost 7% in real terms. The Tories should be utterly ashamed of that. But let me turn to tax. And, you know, we are, of course, seeing the true colours of the Tories really highlighted today. When we set our budget on the 12th of December, the decisions we take will be driven by our determination to protect our National Health Service and our other public services, to tackle poverty and low pay, and ensure that those who earn the most in our society make a fair and reasonable contribution to our public services. It will be a balanced, progressive and fair budget, and it will stand in stark contrast to the one that we saw on Monday. But let me look at tax in more detail. And I am really surprised that Jackson Carlaw is prepared to defend the reality of this. Again, let me cite the Resolution Foundation. So these are not Scottish Government figures. 84% of the benefit from the Tory tax cut for the richest goes to the top half of the income spectrum. 37% of that goes to the top 10% of income earners. And then looking ahead, and I'm quoting here the Resolution Foundation, the overall impact of tax and benefit policies put in place by the Tory government since 2015 will, on average, make richer households better off by £390 a year, and the poorest fifth of households £400 a year worse off. Shameful. That is absolutely damning and shameful. And I'd be really interested to hear if Jackson Carlaw is prepared to stand up and defend that.
Jackson Carlaw.
Well, I'll tell you something. Audit Scotland's not very impressed with your efforts to protect the NHS because they think its current forecast is completely unsustainable. And what we get from the First Minister really is the usual basket of cliches. This was a budget which froze fuel duty and delivered a tax cut of £132 to the record number of Scots in work. It delivered a freeze on the duty on whisky, welcomed by the industry. Help for the oil and gas sector, welcomed by those in it. More than £500 million for Scotland's NHS. Help for our high streets, investment in our roads. And the SNP response? An all too predictable whinge. How tired, lacklustre and miserable. They wanted a freeze in whisky duty, they got it. They wanted support for oil and gas, they got it. They wanted to see the money, they got £950 million worth of it. If ever Scotland wanted evidence that this is a grudge and grievance government led by a grudge and grievance First Minister, this was it. Why can't she for once, just once, First Minister, welcome it?
First Minister.
Well, isn't it interesting and isn't it very, very illuminating that when I quoted the Resolution Foundation about how the Tories are cutting tax for the richest in our society while continuing to punish the poor, and asked Jackson Carlaw to have a go at defending that, he just changed the subject. I think lots of people will have listened to Jackson Carlaw today and realised that he is completely unable to defend the policies of his own party at Westminster. Let's turn back to the NHS and tax. Firstly, let us not forget, of course, that as a result of our budget decisions last year, 55% of taxpayers in Scotland right now pay less tax than counterparts across the UK because of our new starter rate, not helping those at the top, helping those at the bottom of the income scale. That's a progressive change. And when it comes to the NHS, for weeks now, the Tories have been challenging the Scottish Government to say what we're going to do with the £600 million of consequentials that we were going to get in this budget for the Health Service. Now, we will pass on every penny of consequentials for the Health Service to the Health Service. But interestingly, it's not £600 million that's been delivered. It's only 550, and that will cost. And that will cost Scottish people more than £250 million over the period. But my final point, presiding officer, and the Tories might want to listen to this, because that figure of £550 million has another significance, does it not? Because that's also the figure that would have been taken out of the Scottish budget if we'd followed Tory calls to cut tax for the richest in this financial year. That would have been the equivalent of taking 13,000 nurses out of our health service. So this government stands for public services. It stands for helping the poorest in our society. It stands for fairness and progressive principles. And what we've seen today is that the Tories stand for tax cuts for the rich and just cuts for everybody else. And Jackson Carlaw can't even try to defend it. Utterly shameful.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, the First Minister once pledged that in government the SNP, and I quote, will not force students into deeper and deeper debt, and would further meet the debt repayments of Scottish graduates living in Scotland. When the First Minister made that promise, the average debt for a Scottish graduate was £6,070. First Minister, what is the average debt today?
First Minister.
Debt for students in Scotland is at the lowest level of any country in the UK. It is significantly lower than in England. It is significantly lower than in Northern Ireland. And it's also significantly lower than in Labour-run Wales. And that's because we don't have tuition fees. We're protecting students from having to pay tuition fees. And we've got one of the best student support systems anywhere in the UK. And of course, in recent months, we've announced increases to the support we give students. So we'll continue to give Scottish students the best deal anywhere in the UK, and we will continue to be proud to do so.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, let me give the Chamber, which the First Minister did not. New figures published this week show that the average debt for a Scottish graduate now stands at £13,200. That's more than double. Yet Nicola Sturgeon not only promised Scottish students that they would not be forced into deeper debt, she promised them that their debts would be written off. They would be cancelled. Let me quote an SNP election leaflet from the time, which said that we will write off the accumulated debt still owed to the student loans company by Scottish domiciled students. And now we know, presiding officer, that Nicola Sturgeon did not dump the debt, she dumped the promise. Because this week, it was also confirmed by the Student Awards Agency for Scotland that the SNP has cut student grants and bursaries by a third since 2012. And it has increased student loans by a staggering 182%. over the last decade. The First Minister was not prepared to tell us what the average student debt is, but can she tell us what the total value of student debt in Scotland is?
First Minister.
Student debt in Scotland is lower than student debt in any other part of the UK because of the policies of this government. Richard Leonard cites the figure in Scotland of £13,230. In England, average student debt is £34,800. In Northern Ireland, it is £22,440. And in Wales, where Labour are in government, student debt is not the £13,000 it is in Scotland, it is £21,500. Yet another example of Labour telling us to do as they say, not as they do. But Richard Leonard cites figures published this week, so let me share with them some of the figures that were published this week by the Students' Awards Agency Scotland. Total student support is up by 4.5% to £882.7 million last year. Average HE student support in Scotland was up 1.4% since 2016 and 17. More full-time higher education students than ever before are receiving support, up 3.1% since 2016-17. We paid out more in grants and bursaries last year, up 8.9%, and the number of students receiving a grant or bursary increased by 2.8% to 53,620 from the year before. And as I've already said, of course, Student Loans Company statistics show that students in Scotland continue to have the lowest debt in the UK. And my final point in that, we don't just have the lowest debt for students in the UK, that gap is growing year on year. So that's our record on student support. It's one to be proud of, and we'll continue to support students as best we possibly can.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, if the First Minister had read further into that report, she would have found the answer to the question I actually asked, which is that the total student debt in Scotland is now almost £5 billion. So the SNP in office has presided over a 169% increase in that debt. And let us be clear, it's the poorest students who end up racking up the highest debts by taking out the biggest loans. And that's not just my view, that's the view of the National Union of Students in Scotland, who this week said, and I quote, "Students in the lowest household income bracket still finish their course with the most debt." Even by the standards of this government, promising to scrap student debt and then increasing it by 169% is nothing short of shameful. A generation of students have started high school and gone to university since the SNP made and then surreptitiously dropped their promise on student debt. That's a generation of students burdened with debt repayments that the SNP promised that they would write off. As a result, these current and former students may still owe a debt to the government, but this government owes them an unreserved apology. So will the First Minister today do the right thing, and will she apologise for her £5 billion broken promise?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I think there are students in Scotland who started and finished degrees in the time it took Richard Leonard to ask that question. Anyway, do you know, when I was pointing out the fact that students in Labour-run Wales have significantly higher debt than students in SNP-governed Scotland, there were those in the Labour benches who were saying that's not relevant. Well, let me tell you what certainly is relevant. Richard Leonard is the representative of a party that, when they were in power, supported charging students tuition fees. And he stands here now and has the gall to moan about student debt. So not only do we have the lowest debt for students in the UK, not only are, according to all of those statistics published this week, actually increasing the amount we pay to support students, we set out further plans. Over £21 million will be invested every year by the end of this Parliament to improve the support available to students at university and college. Next year we'll invest £16 million to increase and expand access to further and higher education. Bursaries for students from the lowest income families. We will increase the higher education bursary income threshold. We'll increase bursary support for the poorest young students in higher education. We'll increase bursaries for the poorest independent students in higher education. And of course, we're going to be paying a bursary equivalent to the real living wage to all care experienced students in higher and further education. So not only do we have a proud record, we've got the best plans of any party in this chamber for supporting students in the future. So we'll continue to get on with the job and leave Labour to the various contortions they managed to get themselves into.
A number of constituency supplementaries, three in fact. First from Tavish Scott and Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, Highlands Airports Limited confirmed that they will impose car parking charges on islanders travelling from Sunborough Airport in Shetland. There's been no consultation, no island impact assessment and no new public transport links between Sunborough and Lerwick, which is 25 miles away. Could the First Minister explain what's happened to island proofing?
First Minister.
Well, Highlands and Islands airports have to take decisions that they think are balanced and allow them to support and to invest in the airport facilities that are there. Of course, they should do proper island proofing. Tavish Scott is absolutely right about that, and they should make sure that they consult. I will ensure that the Transport Secretary discusses this issue with Hayal and corresponds with the member once he's done so.
Maurice Golden.
Cameron Barclay, a six-year pupil from Renfrewshire, is trying to study for his advanced hires. I say trying because he must attend 3 separate schools and because Renfrewshire Council refused to help him with taxi costs, he must make a 45-minute cycle journey between them that sees him miss both class time and lunches every week. Does the First Minister think this is acceptable?
First Minister.
Well, I don't know the individual circumstances of young Cameron Barclay. I'm more than happy to look into that. But, of course, one of the things we try to do, I've had exchanges with Ruth Davidson on this issue at previous sessions of First Minister's questions, is ensure that young people have as broad a range of qualifications that they can access, and some schools and different clusters will provide different qualifications and young people will go to different schools to access them. So that is the part of how we deliver qualifications. As I say, I'm more than happy to ask the Deputy First Minister to look into the specific case that the member is raising. But the principle here is that we want to ensure that young people get access to as broad a range of qualifications as it is possible to do.
And Pauline McNeill.
The First Minister is only too aware of the impact of 2 fires on Sucky Hall Street in Glasgow, where those businesses have been closed for months on end. Some are still struggling, and sadly, some will probably not make it. Does the First Minister agree that Glasgow deserves the same treatment as Belfast, who in the budget were awarded £2 million for their equally tragic circumstances of the Primark fire fallout? Does the First Minister agree that this is appalling, that Glasgow's needs were ignored? And I know she has been helpful to the business in Sucky Hall Street, for which I am very grateful. But will the First Minister meet with people of Sucky Hall Street businesses to discuss what further help can be given to the City of Glasgow?
First Minister.
Well, the Finance Secretary has already met with businesses affected by these 2 fires, and he intends to continue to do that and to engage with them in the run-up to our own budget in December and indeed beyond. The Scottish Government has already provided financial support, both in terms of business rates relief, but also in terms of the £5 million fund that we set up to allow businesses to access financial support. And a number of businesses have taken advantage of that. I do regret the fact that I certainly don't regret the fact that Belfast got support. I think that was right and proper, but I regret the fact that that was given to Belfast and there was not the same consideration by the UK Government to the situation in Glasgow. But of course, the responsibility of the Scottish Government through our own financial decisions is to make sure we are taking all appropriate steps to help businesses affected, and I can assure the member that we will continue to do exactly that.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Later today, Parliament will debate the treatment of asylum seekers in our society in view of the continued threat of an imminent wave of mass evictions and mass destitution in Glasgow. And I hope the vast majority of us will unite in revulsion at the UK Government's brutal policies and also in determination to take action to support asylum seekers and other vulnerable migrants. People like Abdul. He was refused asylum and has been destitute in Glasgow now for 2 years. He has serious epilepsy as well as mental health issues stemming from his persecution in Afghanistan as well as from his homelessness here. This summer, he was discharged from an emergency hospital appointment to a shelter that didn't have space for him. As I speak, Abdul is facing destitution again tonight. He'll spend yet another unsafe night on the streets with literally nowhere to go. Only once he has short-term, safe emergency accommodation staffed by professionals who can meet his health needs, only then can he start making choices in his life again, rather than being forced to make the grimmest survival decisions night after night. That provision doesn't yet exist, and with winter coming, it's needed now. Can the First Minister tell us, 5 months after the Scottish Government accepted the recommendation that there must be funding for emergency accommodation for those at immediate risk, what progress is being made and when will this provision be available?
First Minister.
Well, the recommendations that were made by the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Task Force, the initial recommendations that were made in the run-up to last winter were accepted in full, and funding was made available, and that funding was used to very good effect to help many of those who were facing rough sleeping, and those working on the front line who helped shape those recommendations, those that I've spoken to, are very positive about the impact they have. As Patrick Harvey knows, there have been further streams of recommendations made by that task force. They've now published their final recommendations, and we are working through the implementation of all of those, and it's an ongoing process. In terms of asylum seekers, I mean, there are, and obviously I don't know the particular circumstances of the individual that Patrick Harvey has mentioned today. Often with asylum seekers there are issues around recourse to public funds, which complicate some of the provision that the Scottish Government would want to see provided. I abhor the way in which the UK system often exacerbates the trauma that asylum seekers have experienced and the trauma that has brought them to this country. I want to make sure that we do everything we can to help them in the situations that they face, but also that our actions to tackle rough sleeping and homelessness are not just about helping asylum seekers, but are helping everybody who faces that circumstance. In terms of the detail, there was a large number of recommendations made by the Homelessness Task Force. In terms of the detail of where all of them are in progress of being implemented, I'm more than happy to get the Cabinet Secretary and Kevin Stewart, the Housing Minister, to write to Patrick Harvey and set out the progress against each and every one of them.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. And I appreciate the tone of the First Minister's answer, and I do believe that the Scottish Government wants to get this right. We in Scotland should reject the wider hostile environment policy on migration in general that comes from the UK Government, but also reject the idea that asylum seekers are a burden. To be asked for asylum is to be in a privileged position. To be able to offer asylum to those who need it is to be privileged. To have to ask, that's what it is to bear a burden. But we do need more than just that firm sentiment and the commitments to act. We need that action to be immediate, especially as the nights grow colder. We need an urgent timetable for the implementation of that recommendation on emergency accommodation provision, an integrated service that includes support services as well. And we know that there isn't a legal barrier to funding those services, even for those people that the UK Government has abandoned with the label "no recourse to public funds." So if the First Minister agrees that no one should be made destitute in 21st century Scotland, will she give a clear commitment that the Scottish Government will take the action necessary to prevent this humanitarian crisis on our own doorstep?
First Minister.
Yes, I will give that commitment. As I said in my previous answer, we are in the process of implementing all of the recommendations of the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Task Force. We learned a lot from the winter initiatives that were taken last year, and those lessons will be applied this year. We are, of course, committing significant funding to this. We have, out of the Ending Homelessness Fund, we've allocated more than £23 million to get on with implementing these recommendations. We've also recently announced, of course, additional funding for the Housing First approach. So I absolutely agree, and I would say that the sentiment that I'm expressing here in terms of the detail of what we're doing to tackle rough sleeping and homelessness is backed up by the practical action we're taking. More generally, I do not think we should ever see those who seek asylum as a burden. We are undertaking our moral responsibility in offering asylum to people here. But given the nature of the constituency I represent, I make representations regularly on the part of a large number of asylum seekers. And what we often find with people who come here seeking asylum is that they are highly skilled, highly educated people. And one of the things I believe very strongly is they should be allowed, as so many of them want to do, to work and make a contribution while they're here. So I would hope that this Parliament on all of these issues can unite, calling the UK Government to change the rules that are causing and exacerbating so much of the misery that asylum seekers are facing, but also get behind the work that we are doing around tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, not just for asylum seekers, but for everybody who faces that situation.
A couple of further supplementaries. The first from Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister share my concern that this week's UK budget was a missed opportunity to end the rollout of universal credit? The Chancellor's proclamation that universal credit is here to stay risks driving more children into poverty and forcing families to depend on food banks, as the 5 food banks in Glasgow Anniesland.
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that. The extra money that was announced for universal credit and the changes to the work allowances within universal credit would of course welcome, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough. Universal credit is still going to adversely affect many people and lead many people into rent arrears and debt that would be completely avoidable. So I still take the view that universal credit should not be tinkered with. Universal credit should be halted, and I hope this Parliament continues to call on the UK Government to do exactly that. Interestingly, I quoted the Resolution Foundation a couple of times already today, but you know, the point they made about how the income tax threshold increases and indeed the increases to the universal credit work allowances, that these changes do not offset the impact of the benefits freeze for lower income households. So it's not just about universal credit, it's about the overall impact of the welfare cuts that we're seeing, which, as I said earlier on, is leading to a situation where the richest in society are going to end up better off and the poorest in society are going to end up worse off. I think that, as we saw from Jackson Carlow earlier on, is literally indefensible, and I hope this Parliament continues to stand up against it.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. The Scottish Government's consultation on the Protection of Wild Mammals Act ended in January, closed in January. Analysis of the responses was published in July. The vast majority of the 20,000 respondents want to see a real ban on hunting with dogs. The fox hunting season begins again on Saturday, yet the Government still has to publish a response. Does the First Minister believe the Scottish Government has done enough to ensure foxes are not hunted with hounds when the season begins this weekend?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government's response on this is due to be published imminently. I don't have the date for that in front of me right now. I know Cabinet is due to discuss it very soon. I'll ask Rosanna Cunningham to write to the member to give her more detail on the timing of that. Do I think we've done enough? I think we've done the right thing. We asked Lord Bonamy to review the provisions. He has published a report. It's right that we carefully consider the way forward. That's exactly what we're doing, taking full account of the consultation responses that we've received. And as I say, we will set out our response in due course and as soon as possible.
Question number 4, John Mason.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in response to the reported rise in anti-Semitism.
First Minister.
Well, there is absolutely no place in Scotland or anywhere else for any form of anti-Semitism or religious hatred. Last week, of course, we learned of the tragic attack on the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, and my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole chamber, are with all of those affected. We stand in solidarity with the Jewish community across the world. I was reminded of the importance of tolerance, compassion and respect during my visit to Auschwitz earlier this week with school children from across Scotland. I certainly will never forget what I saw there, and none of us should ever ever forget the horrors of genocides around the world. They're a stark reminder of the inhumanity and violence that bigotry and intolerance can cause. We are committed to tackling hate crime and prejudice. We recently launched the Letters from Scotland campaign, which aims to encourage witnesses and victims to report hate crime and help to create a society where hate crime and prejudice of any form is not tolerated.
John Mason.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, and I certainly share her sympathies with those affected by the attack in Pittsburgh. I have to say I also found the visit to Auschwitz incredibly moving, especially when I saw the railway there. Would the First Minister agree that both the words and the tone that politicians use are extremely important and can have a big impact on the people that hear them? And we all need to be wary and careful of the tone we use, including President Trump about Mexico and other people about Israel and about the Jewish communities.
First Minister.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's incumbent on all of us to consider carefully the words and the language that we use and the tone that we use as well. Words do matter, and all of us are aware of the damaging impact that can be inflicted upon individuals and communities through the irresponsible use of language. Everybody in public life has a duty to be aware of that and to understand the importance of the messages, tone and language that we use. It's important that we acknowledge and take time to consider the impact our words can have on people, on their families, and of course that includes personalised attacks and violent language. Personalised attacks, violent language debases all of us, and all of us, each and every single one of us, have a part to play in challenging and confronting that.
Adam Tompkins.
Thank you. The First Minister has referred to her visit this week to Auschwitz. And in reflecting on her visit, as I have reflected on my own visits to Holocaust memorials such as Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, does the First Minister agree with me that above all else, the principal lesson of the Holocaust is that none of us can ever afford to look the other way in the face of anti-Semitism? Even in a country as otherwise welcoming and civilised as Scotland, as Ephraim Borowski of the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities has recently said, Jewish people remain 30 times more likely than others to be targeted for their religion. Is that not the call, First Minister, not merely for words, but for action?
First Minister.
Yes, and I think all of us have to look carefully, not just at what we say, but in how we apply those words in the actions we take. And I, as First Minister and as leader of my party, take that responsibility very seriously, and I hope that goes for others across the chamber. I think for anybody here who hasn't yet had the opportunity to visit Auschwitz, if you get that opportunity, I would thoroughly recommend taking it. It is a profoundly unsettling experience, but an incredibly important one. And as I said when I was there on Tuesday, it's important to remember all of those who suffered and were murdered there and to pay tribute to that suffering. But it is really important that we don't just see what happened there in a historical context. It's not just a history lesson. The Holocaust didn't start in Auschwitz or Birkenau or any of the concentration camps. The Holocaust started in the everyday anti-Semitism and discrimination, the othering and dehumanising of Jews. And that's the lesson that we must learn and apply in our modern lives. And that's why I was so pleased to be there with 200 Scottish school students, and so pleased that the Scottish Government, as many members in this chamber I know do, support the work of the Holocaust Education Trust to make sure as many young people get that experience as possible. It had a profound impact on me, but I know watching the reactions of the young people that I was with, it had a deeply profound impact on them as well. But that can only be to the good as we do everything we can to make sure that those horrors can't be allowed to happen again.
And Neil Findlay.
I fully support the First Minister's words there, but this week the acting leader of West Lothian's SNP councillors and one of his colleagues shared and then defended sharing an article attacking a young female Jewish trade union leader for her work representing low-paid workers. The article cited Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf. The author of the article was rightly suspended by the First Minister's party. Will the First Minister now take further action and suspend both elected councillors and others who spread such offensive, hateful material and attack and abuse people for simply doing their job?
First Minister.
Well, can I respond really seriously and in a very heartfelt way to that legitimate question? Because I think it is important that all of us reflect, to follow up on Adam Tompkins' question, not just on what we say, but on what we do. The author of that blog was suspended from SNP membership earlier this week. Obviously, there will now be due process that has to be gone through, so I won't say any more about that at this stage. What I will say is that the IRA definitions around anti-Semitism will be used in the consideration of that disciplinary complaint. In terms of the SNP councillor, I should say the councillor in question has written to the young woman mentioned today with an unreserved apology, fully recognising that he made a significant error of judgment, and that error of judgment arose out of a lack of understanding and knowledge. Now, there's two things I want to say about this, and I was discussing these things in general terms with some of the members of the Jewish community that I was with on Tuesday. Where people do get things wrong through lack of understanding or knowledge, it is sometimes important that we give them a chance to learn, because education and learning is an important part of combating anti-Semitism, intolerance and racism of all forms. I should say the SNP is responsible for the decisions we take on these things and answerable for those decisions. But we, in all of these matters, and have done so this week, have consulted SCOJEC, the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, about the appropriate response to this particular situation. The second point, and my final point, Presiding Officer, I want to make on this is equally important. You know, I could stand here right now, and I'm not going to, and run through a whole list of alleged failures of Labour or other parties to take these things seriously, and indeed to act as seriously as we have done this week. But I'm not going to do that, because yes, in a democracy, it is really important that we hold each other to account, that we check each other's behaviour and call out unacceptable behaviour. That is a vital part of our democratic process. But, you know, I think it's equally important that, and we're all guilty of this sometimes, but it's equally important that we don't rush to weaponise these things against each other for petty party political reasons. Because on the fundamentals of this, it is actually really important that we stand united to say that anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, intolerance in any form is completely unacceptable. And the SNP will continue to treat it in that way, and will continue to be answerable for the decisions that we make. But ultimately, on these issues, I think there's a lot more that unites all of us than divides us. And I think we would probably do a greater service to the memory of those we've just been discussing, but also to future generations, if we actually took the time to stand in solidarity on these issues as much as we choose to divide.
Question number 5, Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to ensure that there is mental health support for college and university students.
First Minister.
Every student should have access to emotional and mental health and wellbeing support. That's why our programme for government includes a commitment to provide more than 80 additional counsellors in colleges and universities over the next 4 years, with an investment of around £20 million. We're also supporting NUS Scotland's Think Positive project, which aims to find ways to support students experiencing mental ill health, tackle stigma and discrimination and promote well-being. And we'll continue to work closely with the university and college sectors, NUS Scotland and other partners on the implementation of the additional counsellors, and to ensure an integrated and wraparound approach to student well-being in both higher and further education.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you. I thank the First Minister for that answer. She will be aware of the number of university students in Scotland seeking support for mental health issues has increased by 2/3 over 5 years. Information from universities across Scotland for the numbers of students seeking some form of support found that 11,700 students asked for help in 16-17 compared to 7,000 in 12-13. Cases ranged from anxiety to depression, gender-based violence and body dysmorphia. Therefore, can I ask the First Minister how she plans to ensure that mental health funding is split across colleges and universities fairly, and when, as she has just indicated, there is some implementation going on, can the students expect to see more counsellors on the campuses?
First Minister.
Well, the short answer to that important question is yes. The announcement we made in the programme for government, and obviously there'll be more details of this around our budget in a few weeks' time, is that we're going to invest significantly in putting additional counsellors into schools and also into colleges and universities, and that will have an impact on campuses across the country. Rachel Hamilton talked about the increase in students coming forward for support, and she's absolutely right to do so. That, of course, reflects an increase across society in people coming forward for support with mental health issues. And as I've said many, many times before, that in some ways is something we should welcome, because it is a sign that the stigma associated with mental health is reducing, but it puts a responsibility on government's shoulders to make sure that the services are there. As well as investing more, we need to reconfigure rather the way in which mental health services are delivered, having much more preventative support, much more support in places like schools, colleges and universities, in police stations, for example, in GP services. That's exactly what we are trying to do. Perhaps one of the most important things that we're going to be doing as we implement these plans is developing the community mental wellbeing service, which will cater for everybody in the 5 to 24-year-old age group. So there's a whole range of things that it's important we take forward, and we're committed to continuing to do so.
Question number 6, David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what recent discussions the Scottish Government has had with the European Commission regarding the Highlands Islands exemption from the air departure tax.
First Minister.
Well, we want to protect the existing Highlands and Islands exemption from the air departure tax. We've written to the UK Government asking them to notify the exemption for approval to the European Commission, and have had ongoing discussions with them on this matter. As the EU member state, only the UK Government can engage with the European Commission to pursue this notification. However, as has previously been set out, notification is only one avenue. We're also continuing to explore a range of different options to try and find the best possible solution to the Highlands and Islands exemption issue. And of course, this needs to be resolved before EDT can be introduced in Scotland.
David Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for her answer. The First Minister will be well aware of the calls from some quarters of the aviation industry south of the Highland Line to kill off the exemption, with potential damaging consequences for businesses and communities across my region. Can the First Minister give Parliament an absolute assurance today she will resist these misguided demands and protect the interests of the Highlands Islands by preserving this vitally important exemption?
First Minister.
Well, it's not just that I can give an assurance of that. The actions we've taken to date demonstrate that we are absolutely determined to protect the Highlands and Islands exemption. You know, we have taken the decision that ADT cannot be introduced, and some of the policy changes we want to make can't then therefore happen until we've resolved this issue of the exemption. So we continue to take steps to try to get the UK Government to come up with us with the solutions to this issue. Unlike, I don't know who exactly David Stewart is quoting, but I certainly would not support anybody who wanted to kill off the exemption. We understand that that exemption is important for the economy and connectivity of the Highlands and Islands, and that's why we're taking the action that we are to try to protect it.
Question number 7, Mike Rumbles.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in light of ScotRail's performance falling to its lowest level since the current franchise began.
First Minister.
Well, I am fully aware of the performance issues that ScotRail requires to address. However, the most recent punctuality statistics were impacted significantly by the severe weather seen during Storm Ali. This, of course, included damage to overhead power lines and trees falling onto tracks. Notwithstanding these issues, we continue to impress upon senior management of Network Rail the need for a renewed focus on maintaining the network infrastructure in Scotland, and that will help ScotRail to meet its challenging but achievable targets. Michael Matheson is due to meet Sir Peter Hendy, Chair of Network Rail, and the ScotRail Alliance separately over the next week, and he'll be making it clear that it is absolutely imperative that performance improves swiftly and effectively to the standards expected by passengers. Of course, this process would be helped by the full devolution of Network Rail, a move that would allow the appropriate parliamentary oversight to be put on the whole of the rail infrastructure in Scotland rather than just on part of it.
Mike Rumbles.
More services are running late. Carriages are jam-packed because the new fleets are well behind schedule, and ScotRail's performance, quite frankly, stinks. And now that is being taken to an all-too-literal level. This week, we learned ScotRail will be dumping human waste on tracks, thanks to the rollout of trains that first entered service in the 1970s. ScotRail calls these trains classic. Is that the description the First Minister would use? And does she think this practice is acceptable in a 21st century rail system?
First Minister.
It's not a practice that we support, and ScotRail have also said that it's not one they want to see continue. It's an interim measure. It is regrettable, and ScotRail are working to mitigate the issue as soon as possible. The Scottish Government, of course, has directly funded previous installation programmes to eradicate that practice across ScotRail fleets. It will be necessary to introduce some unrefurbished high-speed trains into the service for an interim period, but it is important that ScotRail works to resolve that as quickly as possible. In terms of the wider performance issues, it is important, notwithstanding what I said in my initial answer, to stress that nearly 90 out of 100 trains arrive within the recognised punctuality measure. The latest figures showed ScotRail's public performance measure at 87.7%, which is above the GP average of 85.8%. And the figures in the last period were affected, as I said, by Storm Ali and the severe weather that came with that. My final point is, again, the one I made. More than half of the delays on ScotRail trains are to do with Network Rail infrastructure. Now, we continue to work hard with Network Rail to try to resolve that. We fund Network Rail's operations in Scotland, but it would help this if we got the whole chamber to get behind the calls for Network Rail to be properly devolved, so that we could ensure that scrutiny and oversight of the whole of the rail infrastructure. And I hope that's something Mike Rumbles will support.